While doing research for my previous video about Midnight Race Club Supercharged, I discovered that there exist a seemingly infinite number of obscure, low-budget racing games that no one has ever really heard of, mostly on PC. Seeing as my previous videos about such games have performed relatively well, and there appears to be a near-bottomless well of similar content for future videos, I've decided to turn this into a full-on series for my channel. Welcome to the first official episode of Obscure Old Racing Games. Yeah, I couldn't come up with a better title. For this inaugural episode, I'm going to be taking a look at a game with relatively high production value that's also not available on PC. But I assure you, it's plenty obscure. This is Code R, a Japanese-only racer released exclusively for the Sega Saturn in 1998. Now, this is the part of the video where I would tell you who made this game, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I know that Quintet was heavily involved, which is a name that should be familiar to fans of old-school JRPGs. This is the studio that was behind pretty much every game that Enix published on the Super Nintendo, including both ActRaiser games and the Gaia trilogy. Most sources credit Quintet with the development of Code R, with the creatively named Entertainment Software Publishing acting as the publisher, and this is reflected on the game's packaging. However, when you actually boot up Code R, the pre-title screen credits list another group known as Team 7. There's almost no information about Team 7 online, and Code R is the only game they seem to have had any involvement in. According to GameFAQs, Team 7 is the real developer of this game, with Quintet only acting as publisher and no mention of ESP. Then there are other sources that make no mention of Team 7, but list Quintet as a co-publisher for Code R alongside ESP. Personally, I suspect Team 7 was a smaller development team or studio within Quintet, but I can't find any sources to back that up. If anyone wants to try and solve this little mystery, let me know, and feel free to leave your findings in the comments down below. So just to recap, what we have here is an early 3D racer, exclusive to a console that was notoriously difficult to develop 3D applications for, that was most likely made by a company whose prior output consists entirely of 2D role-playing games. Oh yeah, and because this is a Quintet game, it's also a visual novel/RPG. This should be interesting. Upon starting the game, we get immediately hit by what is quite possibly the greatest bit of opening text I've ever seen. Wake up! What a hell are you gonna make? What a hell are you gonna make? This is the actual official tagline for this game. It's on the front cover and everything. I have no idea how this happened, or why this line is even in English considering Code R didn't make it outside of Japan, but this is absolutely glorious. What does it have to do with racing? What is it supposed to mean? I don't know. What a hell are you gonna make, indeed. After that incredible bit of opening text, we go straight into an extremely compressed pre-rendered cutscene. This honestly looks really good for 1998. It's clear someone was very proud of the rain effect on this car, because almost the entire first half of this cutscene is nothing but close-up panning shots showing it off. Finally, we get to the title screen, and it's here that I noticed that Code R takes advantage of the Saturn's high-resolution video mode. All the 2D artwork and menus are rendered at 480p. There's a lot of really well-made artwork on display here, and it all looks incredibly crisp, especially for the time. If you showed me one of these visual novel segments without context and told me it was running on the PS2, I'd totally believe it. I actually think these images may look better in my HD video capture than they do in person on my TV, which is almost never the case for these old console games. Now, the actual 3D racing portions predictably knock the resolution back down to 240p, and right away it's clear that these sections have not aged nearly as well as the 2D bits. Code R runs at 30 FPS, and it's a fairly fluid and stable 30 FPS all things considered. The car feels extremely smooth to control, especially considering that I'm playing this with a D-pad. Unfortunately, the frame rate tends to go downhill as soon as more than one car gets involved, and that's with what looks to be some pretty severe compromises to the visuals. The extreme limitations of the Saturn hardware did not do this game any favors. The car models are extremely basic and consist mostly of single-color, unshaded polygons. The draw distance is an absolute joke. Everything pops in so close to the camera that the fog effect they added doesn't come close to covering it up properly. You're perpetually driving into an endless void, with the path in front of you being laid out just quickly enough to keep from going over the edge. Maneuvering in this game can get a little disorienting because there isn't always a clear frame of reference for how fast you're going, nor how long until the next turn is. Even with these limitations, it's clear that whoever made this had some serious technical know-how to be able to squeeze this kind of 3D performance out of the Saturn. You can see just how hard they had to optimize things to keep the frame rate up, with every polygon in the terrain being loaded and unloaded individually, as to avoid rendering anything more than what was absolutely necessary. This game clearly had a lot of effort put into it by some very talented people on both the art and technical sides, which makes it a real shame that the end product just isn't very good. I'll start with the visual novel/role-playing sections, though I fully acknowledge that I'm not really qualified to review them given that I can't read Japanese. What I can say is that the way these sections are presented is fairly unique, especially for the time. The career mode is structured similarly to that of Gran Turismo, but with a big helping of anime layered on top. The career mode menu is presented as a map of the area the game takes place in, with each menu item corresponding to a physical location in the game world. In addition to things you might expect, like racetracks and garages, there are also locations that only exist for the sake of realism and narrative context, like apartments, houses, and restaurants. NPCs can appear in any of these locations when you visit them, and you'll be forced into a visual novel dialogue sequence when that happens. There's a lot of text in this game, including a huge monologue from who I presume is the main villain before the game even starts, and unfortunately, I don't understand any of it. This game was clearly meant to be something of an immersive simulation, as all the design here leads hard into a sort of grounded realism. There's a day-night cycle, with certain events and character interactions being time-dependent, and your car has a limited supply of gas that needs to be regularly refilled. I really do wish this game had an English localization, because I know I'm not experiencing the full depth of these systems, and there's a lot here that I'm sure was innovative for its time, and may still be unique among racers to this day. Unfortunately, the language barrier here made it so I wasn't able to really make progress in the career mode. The only thing I could figure out how to do reliably was run practice time trials on a few of the tracks, which just burns gas without accomplishing all that much. Luckily, there were 2 arcade modes, separate from the campaign, so I can try out some actual races instead of just bumbling around in a bunch of menus I can't read. And I'm sad to say that the racing here isn't all that great. Now, it's not nearly as bad as some of the other racers I've looked at on this channel, but it's definitely more frustrating than any of those other titles, and it's fair to say the core driving experience of Kodar has not aged very well at all. I already mentioned some of the problems that are caused by the terrible draw distance, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The most omnipresent problem is the handling model. I said earlier that this game is extremely smooth to control, but the truth is, it's smooth to a fault. It feels like your car has a fraction of the traction and weight behind it that it should, and the steering, while extremely responsive, is way too sensitive. It often feels like the car is gliding and bouncing along the track as opposed to actually driving, and the intuition you may have developed from driving cars in other games doesn't entirely translate. I did get the hang of it eventually, and there were a number of tuning options that can help things out a bit, but even after several hours and multiple tuning sessions, something still felt a little off about the way this car controls. The wonky handling presents the biggest issue for time trials, which for some reason are stupidly difficult, bordering on the impossible. The time targets you have to beat require a flawless run through some pretty long tracks, and you're harshly penalized if you so much as brush against a wall. I never managed to beat a single one despite numerous attempts. The level of challenge here is something I would expect from an event near the end of the campaign, not every time trial race in the game. The other race type is called Battle, which is really just a standard one-on-one race. This mode is easily the best part of Kodar gameplay-wise. For one thing, it's actually possible to win with a bit of practice. Having another racer to contend with goes a long way towards breaking up the monotony of these tracks, as well as exposing a few quirks of the physics engine. It's still fairly basic and gets repetitive after a while, but I actually did have fun during the hour or so I spent trying to climb the ladder in battle mode. The rivals themselves all have these goofy little intros with unique hand-drawn portraits, and there's a decent variety to the cars they drive. Unfortunately, these 2 modes are the full extent of the racing in Kodar as far as I'm aware. There are never any events that involve more than 2 racers, presumably due to hardware restrictions, nor are there any that mix up the rules or objectives at all. I've never really been all that big on simulation racers, and this one is ultimately pretty basic and kinda dull when you get right down to it. That is aside from the visual novel bits, which I can only assume are interesting. Even if this game did have a perfect English localization, I don't think I'd have the patience to play through an RPG-length campaign with only 2 race types to carry it. Code R is one of those titles whose concept and mere existence is way more interesting than the game itself. When I say the phrase, Gran Turismo, but it's an RPG for weebs, you probably imagine something way more exciting than anything I've shown you here. But there is one more thing. This game does actually manage to live up to its potential in one small area. I give you replay mode.
なんだ今のどこぶつけたんだ俺のプレッシャーが効いたのかどうなったんだ睡魔に襲われたっす
I think this pretty much speaks for itself. The way they cut in these random characters and bits of commentary to try to frame this race as some sort of epic anime battle is hilarious to me. Though, since we already know the outcome, and there's no way to save replays, any attempt made to ratchet up the tension here is rendered kinda pointless. I still love this execution, though.
Ah!
Code R is a game that, while interesting and not completely terrible, I don't think I'll ever have a desire to revisit. Though if you like Initial D, can read Japanese, don't mind a bit of jank, and can deal with repetitive races, this might just be the game for you. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Hit those like and subscribe buttons if you feel so inclined. Also, because I'm doing this as a series now, be sure to leave any suggestions for future obscure racing games you want me to look at in the comments below. I've got a couple titles in mind that I want to go over, but beyond that I don't have much of a long-term plan for this series. I think that's all. Bye.